Please, let's have a warm round of applause for Aarti Shahani. It is Republic Day. I wore my green, my white, and there's my orange in my socks. So there you go. That is the Indian flag at work. I am honored to be sitting here with Aarti Shahani. I've been a fan for many years. I've been listening to you on NPR. I listen to NPR every day, and I hear your voice very often. I do. I'm a big fan of it.
Good.
So let's start at the very, very beginning, and I already know the answer since I read your book, but for the audience here, where were you born?
I was born in Casablanca, Morocco. Very exotic, right?
Yeah, much more than Cincinnati, Ohio.
I ended up being born there. My parents met there over a game of poker. They were each migrants so they're from the part of India that is now known as Pakistan, and they were uprooted during partition. They became among the tens of millions of people that were running from either side. And so they basically spent their lives, you could say, as refugees, though really legally as migrants. And my father, who, he came from India standards, a very humble family. He ended up leaving the subcontinent altogether when he was a teenager to go and become a migrant worker in Beirut. And so he'd worked in Beirut, he'd worked throughout the Middle East, actually Algeria, he'd been to Tunisia, he'd traveled quite a bit. America was not his first rodeo.
Although it probably was his first rodeo. Could be.
Good.
Could be.
That was good.
You're the opposite of a one-word answer. I've interviewed people. I'm like, where were you born? They're like, Casablanca. That's it. I love how
you've got. To stop?
No, it's good. No, I don't want you to. This is great. That's
no,
like I have 40 questions, but we're only going to get.
No,
to
you know
two
what?
of them.
My brother-in-law, he joked because he my sister's husband. He's like, look at that. She's got an audiobook. Now she can have the one-way conversation she always dreamed of.
So true. That's why I do stand-up.
Yeah.
I wanted to be a therapist, but they only listen for what an awful occupation. You have to listen to other people. That'd be my hell. Like I want to.
Yeah.
I want to talk. I don't want to listen. That sounds awful.
We can make this about you.
We can. I'm going to be careful not to do that. I'm not going to do that.
I'm cool.
I did that with Asif Manvi. I'm not going to do that with you.
Oh, you did.
Very much so. So, where do you currently live?
I currently live in Oakland, California.
Oakland, California, fellow Californian.
Mm-hmm.
And do you use your education? Where did you go to school, and do you feel like you use your education?
I have never gotten a job in anything I have studied.
Go on. I wasn't punching on you. As your brother-in-law said. Come on,
there we go.
Audience.
That's right. I would say that, listen, school is where I learned how to write. And I would say that the most transformative educational experience of my life, it didn't happen in college, it didn't happen in grad school, it didn't happen in a fellowship. It happened in 9th grade. In 9th grade, I went from being public school kid at Rachel Carson IS 237 in Flushing, Queens, to Flushing? Is there Flushing in the house? Woo! All right.
Wow, amazing.
Love it.
Flushing in the house.
Flushing gets around.
Not a lot of toilets, but Flushing.
No.
So that's really great. That's great.
The reason that Flushing, it's what's amazing to me is like we migrants have the courage, the audacity, the drive to cross entire oceans, and then as soon as you land at JFK Airport, you get tired and you find a home as close to the airport as you can. I mean, that is the story of Queens. But anyway, so I went and I became a scholarship kid at the Brearley School on the Upper East Side of Manhattan.
And this is a very high-end private
In today's terms, it costs in tuition a Tesla a year to attend. So, yeah, my parents jointly never made that much.
The sedan or the SUV?
The basic.
The basic.
The basic,
okay,
yeah.
All right.
Actually, I don't know what... Well, let's not go. Okay, good.
Hey, you're the tech person. You should know what a Tesla costs.
I think it's like, what is it, 40?
Yeah, I think it's about
exactly.
40. It's not the one we want to get, which we can't get. So,
yeah.
We're going to get a Honda probably, just because we're Indian.
Yeah, but at that school, to finish the question that you'd actually asked me, because I could tell you were moving on.
1.5x.
What I learned at Brearley, and this was like to me such an incredible lesson, was how to write. I came in the 9th grade, and I took such pride in being a great student And like it really kicked my butt. It was the most challenging academic experience of my life. It happened in 9th grade, not in college or after. And one of my teachers, I loved history, and she called me after class. She's like, "Artie, please stay," because I didn't call myself Artie yet. I didn't know how to do that.
You
with
say
my
in the
mouth.
book it's Artie.
Yeah, it's Artie.
Yeah.
I was Artie until I was about 22.
I was Rajiv till 15.
Aw,
Then I
okay.
became Rajiv.
Okay.
But, you know.
But you like that?
I like it's more exotic.
Yeah, I
I
totally
was
get
born
it.
in Cincinnati, not
I get it.
Casablanca, so I can
get
do
it.
what I can.
I get it. But to finish this now even longer anecdote, she sat me down and was like, "Artie, we're going to talk about your writing." And I was like, "What do you mean? What's wrong with my writing?" And basically, I just made no sense on paper. Like what I was supposed, well, like in class, I was always that kid, even as a scholarship kid, like the first week of school where I should have been intimidated. And I'd never seen so many white Americans in my entire life. Like outside of like TV, I just never had that experience because I grew up in an incredibly people of color neighborhood.
You said one of the most diverse zip codes
In the
world.
entire, yeah, I mean, the tracts of land, it's, the entire world converged into Flushing, Queens.
Sure.
Yeah. But she told me, she's like, when you're talking in class, which is often, you make sense. You know how to talk about, cotton growth in Vietnam pre and post invasion of XYZ. But when you write your answers for homework, you make no sense. Like, what are you doing? What's happening? And basically, because when I had the paper in front of me, I thought my job was to find incredibly large words and show that I knew very large words. And she told me that that's not actually how you write. And she told me, she's like, just write how you speak. And like, that was like, whoosh to me. So I was like, aren't I supposed to pretend to be smart on paper? Like, what are you talking about? But yeah, that lesson stayed with me forever.
Do you have a mission statement or a purpose or a North Star that sort of guides you?
Yeah, I do. I apparently, and I actually didn't realize this until fairly recently, I'm like, oh, I'm a storyteller. Some higher power put me here to be a storyteller, and I'm a storyteller who cares about justice.
I like that.
That's pretty much it.
Storyteller who cares about justice. That should be your Twitter bio. I like that.
There we go.
Let me ask you this. What ticks you off? What makes you mad? And did something make you mad enough that you've actually endeavored to change it? And I think I know the answer, but here you go. I'm queuing you up.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just tie it back to the memoir. The federal government's effort to deport my father made me very mad. And I'll give you a little bit of the backstory. I just read you an excerpt about how Dad didn't actually want us to stay here. But we wanted to stay here. And Dad ended up coming back from Dubai and resettling in New York with us after a kind of tragic accident that I won't get into. It's in the book. My dad ended up finding his footing, and he and his little brother, who also migrated to the U.S., we sponsored him in chain migration for a green card. They had a store. They opened their own business in the exact same street where my father shoveled snow. He managed to open his own store that was like 2 stories tall, not just 1 story. The greatest achievement of his professional life. It was such a symbolic place.
28th and Broadway.
Yeah, you got it. Thank you.
I read it.
Yeah. And so he sold electronics, watches, calculators, keyboards. This is before the days of Amazon, before the days of big box retail. We're talking about the 90s, okay? And so while I'm precocious scholarship kid at the Brearley School for Girls, doing my thing, Dad is doing his thing. One day my mom calls me, and she's sobbing, and I have no idea why she's sobbing. She's like, Papa, they've taken Papa. And it turns out my father was arrested, and he was at Rikers Island jail. And
this is one of the harshest prisons.
Yeah, I mean, Rikers Island, which is right by LaGuardia Airport, if you look at it from the sky, it just looks like a bunch of white bunkers. Like you wouldn't know that gang rape is happening inside at any given moment, that people are slashing each other's faces, that there's a vibrant drug trade, so that if you don't go in a dealer, you come out a dealer. According to New York State, my father and uncle were basically a front for the Cali drug cartel of Colombia. And our family business was helping launder drug money for notorious traffickers who were responsible for the assassination of a journalist in Jackson Heights, Queens, who were responsible for, pushing drugs on kids. I mean, it's terrible. I was horrified when I learned that these were the charges against my dad and uncle. My childhood goal was to become a prosecutor, and my mom, as an immigrant to New York, became very active in the community very early in Flushing, Queens, and she organized with other tenants in our enormous building to make sure that there was no dealing in front, that kind of thing. So part of what I waded through in real life and then in the book is how the case unfolded. Just remembering, because you asked me if I've ever been angry. I was so angry at Dad. What did you do? And I was already dealing with, he was achieving at that point the most he'd ever achieved in his life as a lifelong migrant. But for me, as the scholarship kid at Brewerly, it wasn't enough.
Because your peers are people from old money,
Exactly.
very established.
Exactly. Trump's daughter went to school right across from my school. My class included CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. I mean, it was that kind of money.
Sure.
And so I had already felt like he wasn't enough. And then I was like, the Kali cartel? What? So fast forward a little bit, and we go to court, And court was, to me, such a disorienting experience. It was the people versus Shahani. And I was like, oh, my God, we're not the people anymore. We're not the people. It was, very disorienting.
Wasn't the U.S. government versus Shahani? It was the people?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, it's New York State, not the federal government. But, yeah.
Right.
It's the people, yeah.
Okay.
And so peculiar things happened. The prosecutors, after giving this indictment with many, many, many charges, the prosecutors come back and they're like, okay, Mr. Shahani and Mr. Shahani, my dad and my uncle, we'll offer you a plea deal. You can serve 8 months and put the matter behind you. And actually, you can serve 8 months one after the other instead of at the same time so that one man can always run the family business.
Yeah. It seems like a pretty good deal, like they're negotiating with you.
It's also a confusing deal
Yeah.
because if we're just a front for a cartel, why would you structure a deal to let us run the family business? You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah, I know what
Yeah.
you mean. Yeah.
So, as a kid watching this, that's when I learned about the trial penalty. So my dad and uncle did what pretty much, statistically speaking, what everybody in this room would do. You take the plea. Why is that? Because if you don't take the plea, you face what's called the trial penalty. You know about the constitutional right to a trial by a jury of your peers? Well, they don't tell you the way that it's actually practiced is if you go to trial and you were convicted, then instead of 8 months, you could do 12 years or 13 years. And that's the penalty for exercising your right to trial. Most humans don't actually have that capacity to take risk. And so, a window I got into the criminal justice system early on was, it's not actually about innocence and guilt because things don't go to trial, you plead them out. It's really about risk and reward. It's basically the state comes at you. This is just structurally, this is a very dispassionate explanation of what's actually happening. This is not a biased take on it. The state, by design, by strategy, lists out many, many, many charges, and then you enter into a courtroom and you basically try to whittle it down to something that both parties can live with. Fast forward many years. Now I'll say this: the anger that you asked about. My dad and uncle, they agree to their sentences 8 months each, one after the other. My uncle goes in first. He ended up serving 2.5 years instead of 8 months because of a New York State administrative error.
Wait, 2.5 years?
Yeah.
Instead of 8 months?
Correct.
Because of an administrative error?
That's right, by the state. They basically got some paperwork wrong.
Wow.
And that's when I shifted from aspiring prosecutor to kind of faux family defender. And I started writing to the adults involved to be like, hey, what's going on here? This is wrong. And we actually managed to get it fixed.
In this particular case?
In my uncle's case, it was fixed so that he was supposed to be then released from his time inside. Then Dad would go in and it would all be over. But that's not what happened. What happened was that when my uncle was supposed to be released, he went missing for 4 days. We had no idea where he was. If you ever have a loved one who goes missing for 4 days, it's terrifying. You basically think the worst. You think they've been murdered and left at the side of a road. And what ended up happening, now this is my father called me. First time I've heard him cry. Never heard him cry before. He's like, they took him. Immigration took Ratan. Immigration took Ratan. And so it turns out my uncle was taken from one prison to another, and he was going to be deported from the U.S. because laws that didn't exist at the time that he was arrested were being applied to him to exile him permanently, even though he was a lawful permanent resident. I told my father, when Dad called me to say that his brother was being exiled, which also meant my father would be exiled, like it was the same case. I was like, this is double jeopardy. This doesn't happen in America. It's against our laws. Like, you don't have double jeopardy. Uncle Ratan already served his time, more than his time. He's not going to get exiled. He's a green card holder. We're a bunch of naturalized U.S. citizens. What are you talking about? This is America. And I was totally wrong. So my uncle was shipped out to India, where he hadn't lived since the 50s, and my father would be next. And so I ended up launching myself into a campaign to keep my father in this country. I thought, if any of you ever run a campaign, you put a reasonable timeline on it. I thought, I'm going to fight for 6 months, maybe 9 months, maybe a year. I'm going to get this done. I made that commitment when I was about 20. I fought till I was 30.
Now, is this an exception in the American justice system, or is this a rule?
No. Here's like the thing that I try to make really clear in my book. And again, like, honesty really matters to me. Like, I value the truth. And so when I tell you, for example, that that my dad and uncle got a bad deal, here's what it's based on. Once I had my fancy life, I call this my fancy life, okay? Once I got my fancy life, all sorts of people started treating me really nicely. And I'd get invitations to things, and like, people wanted to connect to me on LinkedIn. And one of the people who wanted to connect to me was, get this, the jailer who ran Rikers Island.
Wow.
We connected.
He has a LinkedIn profile?
Yeah. No, everybody does, dude. Like,
that's true.
Yeah, exactly. Like
he took them away in links, and now
it's
yeah.
Oh,
wow.
wow.
Yeah,
I never thought of that pun.
He thought it was a prison site.
Okay.
That's really
That's good.
Genuine laugh. There it was.
Yeah, because I didn't expect it.
Yeah,
that's good. Yeah, thank you.
I was proud of it.
So, anyway, we had friends in common. And he's like, yeah, when you're in Manhattan for work, because I was at that point based in Silicon Valley as NPR's correspondent covering tech, he had said, if you're in town, let's grab coffee. And I'm like, yeah, sure. I love weird people. Like, if you have like a strange role in life, I want to talk to you. It's just how I'm wired. And we had that personal connection, which is Rikers Island. So over coffee, he asks me, how'd you get interested in Rikers and criminal justice? It's obvious that I'm interested in it. And I was like, oh, my father was a prisoner at Rikers. Wasn't expecting that answer. And he's like, is that it? Is that so? Who was the judge in the case? And I was like, oh, the judge is this guy, Joel Blumenfeld. He's like, oh, is that right? He's my very best friend. They go back to the Vietnam War days.
When they were selling cotton.
Yeah. There we go. You paid attention. So he asks me, he's like, hey, Joel's a really nice guy. You want to meet him? And like, dude, he made it sound like a Tinder date. It was like, swipe right on the judge who hit the gavel? Sure. So he introduced me to the judge. The judge via email invited me to come to his chamber sometimes and chat when I'm in town. Just for those of you, just to explain something. The children of defendants do not get to go to the chambers of the judges who hit the gavel. That does not happen in real life, but it happened in real life. So I took the train out to Queens on another trip to New York. At this point, anyway, whatever. I take the train out to Queens. I go into the courtroom, and it's a funny thing, right, about child eyes. In my memory, everything was much bigger. But child eyes, they do that, right? And then I went to the courthouse, and it looked kind of small to me, and I'm like, oh, this is where Dad's life fell apart. And then I go into the courtroom. Oh, this is the courtroom where his life fell apart. I remember him sitting up there. I remember him trying to speak and not being, I remember all of that. And it's a flood. You know, memory, when you feel it, it's like a flood. It's a physical thing. Then I take my card, I hand it to the bailiff. I'm like, I have a business card now. It's so weird. I hand it to the bailiff. Other defendants are looking at me like, who does she think she is? And I'm like, who do I think I am? Like, literally, who, you know, it's one of these existential moments. Bailiff escorts me back to the judge's chamber. Judge opens the door. He's much smaller than I remembered. Like, I thought he was towering, and he's not. He's shorter than me.
He's not up on his...
No, he's not up on the...
What's that thing called? Dais?
The dais, thank you. I liked it, yeah. So he opens the door. First words out of his mouth, like before I've sat down. Your father and uncle should never have taken that guilty plea. What a mistake.
Wow.
And so...
Not a great opening line for a Tinder date. That's terrible. That's awful. That must have hit you...
Very hard.
Extremely hard.
And here's the difference between a daughter and a journalist. It's really, you know, I'm sure like many of you, I would venture to guess every single one of you in this room, you have your public identity, what you present to the world, and you have who you actually are inside. And as you grow older, if you're blessed, they get to stay fairly close. And if you're not, which is most of us, they kind of, right.
Yeah, the thickness of the mask is
Yeah.
really, that's a big correlation between that and happiness.
Yeah, there we go. Exactly. So in that moment, like as a journalist's response to that kind of thing would have been like, huh, that's fascinating. Tell me more. If it bleeds, it leads, guys. Like, we know that. I had zero curiosity about what he meant. Like, literally, all I could see was my father's face, which, you know, I grew up, my father was a brilliant man. He spoke 6 languages. He could multiply large numbers in his head, photographic memory. He just didn't have the luck of birth, okay? And to know that he had been through all he had been through, the war with India and Pakistan, it was war, what we call partition, to live through that, to live as a migrant worker in pretty brutal places, to make it all the way here, and to have it taken so quickly for what was avoidable, it hurt so much, like I didn't even have curiosity about it. And actually, I opened my book describing that visit to the judge, and it took me 2 to 3 years, I can't remember how long, 2 to 3 years to have the wherewithal inside to actually call the guy back and be like, hey, judge, so what did you mean by that? And I did that to write the book and to understand what he meant. Yeah.
Why tech, then? Why not politics or social justice? Why are you the tech correspondent for NPR?
Right. Well, I did recently make a job change. But I'd been for years the tech correspondent. The reason I went into tech, it's like literally the most calculated decision of my entire life. I decided I wanted to be a journalist. I don't have a great journalism story. I can't tell you like, oh, I had these investigative heroes growing up. No. I was interested in being a lawyer. And then I worked with lots of lawyers, and I was like, I don't want to do this. I actually taught a course at NYU Law for lawyers to get continuing education credit. That's how deeply I worked with lawyers.
Wow, that is.
Like, I was in my 20s, and I was like, I don't want to do this.
You're like, I'm going to go back to the prisoners.
Well, I mean, you know, like I didn't feel it was a way that I could achieve justice.
Sure.
It felt too slow to me for that. So I did remember, though, one time I was organizing some rally, and, like, my body was pressed up against a barricade. This was a feature of post-9/11 America. Suddenly there were, like, huge barricades everywhere. It felt like everything felt so physically conflicted. It was very bizarre to me. But I was pressed up against a barricade, and the only people who could cross were police and people with press badges. I was like, that's fascinating. There are people here with this thing, a press badge, and they have access?
Yeah, it's like a loophole, like an exception.
Yeah, and I'm like, I want access. The story of my life is crossing through doors I'm not supposed to walk through. So I was interested in that. Now, through a random set of circumstances, life really is random, I end up connecting to a journalist at NPR who used to know me as a source. I used to give him information about people being beaten in detention, including a death in detention. And he found out that I was interested in becoming a journalist, and he invited me to come into NPR on some sort of made-up fellowship kind of thing that led then to a real fellowship of theirs. And once I got into that fellowship program at NPR, I observed the building. I observed the personalities. And I was like, oh, if I want to be like the premier politics or criminal justice or social issues reporter of our day, the senior reporters will step on my throat. Like, there's no way. I mean, listen, turf, it's real. I'm like, but if I want to report on tech, no one will care. And that was 2012. I mean, this is before Facebook blew up in the way that it has, and we're having conversations in congressional testimony and whatnot. In 2012, tech was like whiz-bangy gadgets.
Right.
And so I thought it was a very practical thing to do, where no editor would question my objectivity. And I wanted to see who I was when I wasn't being an immigrant daughter. Do I have interest? Do I have intellectual curiosity? How smart can I be with the nerds of Silicon Valley? Yeah.
Aarti Shahani.
Thank you.